Oh, are you the next toy for our boss?
When I walked into the office where I would be acting director for a month, the receptionist asked, "Are you the boss's next toy?" I was curious to see how far it would go, so I didn't answer. Later, I stood at the podium and introduced myself. The room fell completely silent. The security gate let me through without hesitation. A soft green light blinked, the turnstile clicked, and that was it. I was inside. No questions, no second look. Just quiet acceptance, as if the building itself had already decided I belonged here. My name is Claire Morgan. For the next 30 days, this company would officially belong to Richard Hale, the director whose name still hung on the door of the top floor office. Unofficially, however, he was gone, and I was here to replace him. Temporarily. That word had been carefully chosen. Temporary replacement. It sounded harmless, almost insignificant. No one had announced my arrival. No one had been told who I was, what I was authorized to do, or how much power I carried for the next month. That silence wasn't an oversight. It was my condition. Power speaks louder when it isn't introduced. I dressed accordingly. A plain light gray blouse, dark trousers, flat shoes. No jewelry except a watch with a worn leather strap. My hair pulled back neatly, without effort or elegance. Nothing that said executive, nothing that demanded respect. I looked like someone you could overlook without consequence, and that was exactly what I wanted. As I stepped into the lobby, I felt the familiar calm settle inside me. Not tension, not excitement, just control. The kind that comes from knowing you are watching a game while everyone else believes they are simply living their routine. The lobby smelled of coffee and polished stone. Glass walls reflected people moving quickly, confidently, already deep in conversations about deadlines, meetings, and weekend plans. No one looked at my face long enough to remember it. A few eyes slid over me, assessed me, and moved on. Good. I walked slowly, letting my gaze wander. The framed company values on the wall caught my attention. Integrity, innovation, respect. I almost smiled. Near the reception desk, two men stood talking openly, not lowering their voices. "Did you hear? Hale's gone for a month," one of them said. The other snorted. "Yeah, nothing will change. This place runs itself." They laughed. I stopped near a column, pretending to check my phone, and memorized their faces. Their voices. The casual certainty in their tone. It wasn't admiration they felt for the director. It was ownership. That told me more than any report could. I didn't go upstairs. Not yet. Richard's office could wait. Instead, I walked through the open workspace, past desks cluttered with personal photos and half-empty coffee cups. Someone brushed past me without apologizing. Someone else asked if I knew where the printer paper was. I answered politely. Each small interaction added a piece to the picture. This company wasn't waiting for leadership. It was used to the absence of it. By the time I returned to the lobby, the intrigue I had arrived with sharpened into something colder, more precise. This wasn't just a month-long substitution. It was an opportunity to see what people became when they believed no one important was watching. I stopped at the reception desk at last. The receptionist looked up with a professional smile. "Good morning. Can I help you?" "Yes," I said calmly. "I'm here for work." It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. She nodded, satisfied, already typing something into her computer. No questions, no request for clarification, no curiosity. That, too, was telling. I took a quiet breath and felt the weight of the coming month settle fully onto my shoulders. 30 days. No visible authority. No announced name. Just observation. And by the end of it, this building would learn the difference between appearance and power, whether it wanted to or not. The man stopped me just as I was about to pass the reception desk. Not abruptly, not rudely. He simply shifted his body half a step to the side, enough to block my path without making it obvious. A practiced move, confident, casual, as if he had done this many times before and no one had ever objected. He was in his mid-30s, maybe 36 or 37. Well-groomed beard, expensive watch, shirt just tight enough to suggest intention. His badge hung low on his chest, swinging slightly as he leaned closer. I noticed he didn't glance at my badge at all. He looked at my body instead. Slowly, openly, like he was evaluating merchandise. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that assumes familiarity without earning it. "Oh," he said lightly, as if making conversation about the weather. "You must be the new secretary." I said nothing. His eyes flicked briefly to my face, then back down again, bold now that silence hadn't stopped him. "For adult entertainment," he added. "For our boss." The words landed without hesitation. No embarrassment. No awareness that he might be crossing a line. He said it the way people say things they've said before, and gotten away with. Behind him, I heard a faint snort of laughter. Someone nearby pretended to cough. Someone else suddenly found the floor very interesting. No one intervened. No one corrected him. I met his eyes and held them. For 1 second, the noise of the lobby faded, the clacking keyboards, the ringing phones, the distant hum of elevators. All of it disappeared behind the simple, quiet fact that he expected a reaction from me. Shock, anger, embarrassment, gratitude disguised as flirtation. Anything but calm. My name is Claire Morgan, and I have learned that silence is often more unsettling than confrontation. "I'm here for work," I said evenly. That was all. No raised voice, no defensive smile, no correction. I didn't tell him who I was. I didn't tell him who I wasn't. I simply stepped slightly to the side, reclaiming my space, and waited. He blinked. Just once. The moment confused him. Not enough to stop him, but enough to irritate him. "Relax," he said, chuckling softly as if I were the one being unreasonable. "I'm just explaining how things work here. No need to get stiff on your first day." I noted the phrase "how things work here" and stored it carefully. "Daniel Reeves," he added, tapping his badge with 2 fingers. "Sales." Of course he was. "Claire," I replied. Only my first name. No title. No explanation. His smile widened, pleased. "See? Easy." He stepped back, granting me passage now that he had established what he believed was dominance. As I walked past him, I felt his eyes follow me. Not discreetly. Not apologetically. Possessively. I didn't look back. Inside, something settled into place. Not anger. Not even disgust. Just clarity. The kind that sharpens your focus and slows your breathing. This wasn't about one man making an inappropriate comment. This was about an ecosystem that allowed it. As I moved deeper into the office floor, I became aware of whispers trailing behind me. "Did you hear what Dan said?" She didn't even react. Probably pretending she's too good for it. I heard every word. I remembered every voice. At my temporary desk, I sat down quietly and opened a blank document on my laptop. I didn't type yet. I just listened, observed, counted the seconds between jokes and silence. Somewhere behind me, Daniel laughed again, loud, confident, untouchable. I looked at the time. 8:47 a.m. And in that moment, I understood something with absolute certainty. This day wasn't going to expose me. It was going to expose them. And Daniel Reeves had just volunteered to be remembered. By noon, I no longer existed as a person. I had become a function, a shadow that moved between desks, a convenient pair of hands, a neutral background presence no one bothered to look at twice. And once people stop seeing you as a person, they start revealing themselves with impressive speed. Hey, sweetheart, can you grab me a coffee? I turned. The man who spoke didn't even look embarrassed. He didn't ask if I worked there. He assumed I did, and that serving him was part of it. His badge said Mark, IT department. I nodded because saying no too early teaches people to be cautious. I wasn't here to make them cautious yet. The coffee machine was down the hall. As I waited, two women nearby leaned toward each other. "She's new, right?" one whispered. "Yeah, probably temporary. You can always tell. They don't matter." They weren't cruel. That was the worst part. Just honest. When I handed Mark his coffee, he glanced at my shoes. "Flat," he commented. "Smart. Heels get you noticed too fast around here." I smiled politely and said nothing. I was asked to print documents I didn't need, to carry boxes no one else wanted to move. Someone snapped their fingers once to get my attention. Another joked about my blouse being safe but boring. Each interaction was small, individually insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern. No one asked my role. No one checked my credentials. No one thought they needed to. I was placed neatly into a category without consultation, and once assigned, I stayed there. I remembered everything. Mark from IT, Sophie from marketing, who laughed a little too loudly at crude jokes. Evan, who said, "Don't worry, you'll get used to it." Like that was comfort. Daniel Reeves, whose voice I heard before I saw him again. He appeared near my desk mid-afternoon, leaning against the divider like it belonged to him. "So," he said, "still surviving?" "I am," I replied. He chuckled. "You're quiet. That's rare." "I listen," I said. "Dangerous skill," he answered, amused. He lowered his voice slightly, not because he respected privacy, but because he liked the intimacy it created. "You know," he continued, "the director's usually very particular about the women around him. If you play it right, this month could change things for you." "For me?" I asked calmly. "Mm-hmm. Visibility, access, opportunities." He smiled again. "You seem smart enough to understand what I mean." I did. And I noted the way he framed exploitation as mentorship. Throughout the day, people spoke freely around me, about who slept with whom, about which complaints went nowhere, about which managers were handsy but harmless, about how HR preferred silence to paperwork. No one lowered their voice when I walked past. Why would they? I didn't have a name worth remembering. At 5:12 p.m., an email notification popped up on my screen. Subject: General Meeting. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Location: Main Hall. I read it twice. Then I looked around. People were already packing up, joking about seating, about who would sit in the front row, about how these meetings were always a waste of time. Daniel passed by again and tapped the desk lightly. "Front row's mine," he said. "You'll want to stand near the wall. Better view." I met his eyes. "Thank you," I said. He winked, satisfied, and walked away. When the office finally emptied, I remained seated. Only then did I open a second document. It wasn't labeled. It didn't need to be. Inside, I began to type names, times, exact phrases, context, not opinions, records. By the time I shut down my computer, the building was quiet, respectful, innocent-looking. I stood, straightened my simple blouse, and picked up my bag. Tomorrow, I would still be nameless. But tomorrow, the room would finally learn who had been watching all along. I noticed Daniel Reeves before he noticed me. That had become a pattern. He entered spaces as if they were already his, leaning, occupying, expanding. He never asked permission with words. His body did it for him. Chairs scraped when he sat. Desks became armrests. Personal space was treated like a suggestion rather than a boundary. This time, he stopped beside the copy room while I waited for documents to finish printing. "Long day," he said, not as a question. "Yes," I replied. He watched the machine hum, then glanced at me, assessing again. I felt his curiosity sharpen. He was no longer just amused. He was interested, and interest in men like him was rarely harmless. You still haven't figured out how things really work here, have you? He said. I think I'm learning, I answered. He smiled. Careful. Learning too fast can be dangerous. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, not because he feared being overheard, but because he liked the illusion of secrecy. Richard Hale, he continued, casually saying the director's name, has his preferences. Everyone knows it. Smart women don't fight it. They use it. I looked at him. Use what? Daniel chuckled, pleased I'd taken the bait. Attention. Proximity. Timing. He shrugged. You'd be surprised how many careers start with being noticed. And end? I asked. He tilted his head. That depends on how grateful you are. There it was. The unspoken rule. Finally spoken aloud. I watched his face as he talked. How relaxed he was. How confident that nothing he said could possibly be used against him. He believed the room belonged to him. That the company belonged to him. That women like me existed on the margins of his importance. That belief loosened his tongue. Look, he said, softer now, almost friendly. You're not stupid. You didn't get here by accident. If you want advice, real advice, I can help you navigate this place. What would that cost? I asked. He laughed, genuinely amused. You're funny. I like that. He straightened and stepped back, satisfied he'd planted something. Just remember, people who pretend they don't want anything usually want the most. The printer beeped. My documents slid out. I picked them up calmly. Thank you for explaining how things work, I said. He nodded, smug. Anytime, Claire? Hearing my name from his mouth felt deliberate, claimed. As I walked away, I could feel his eyes on my back. Not with desire alone, but with expectation. He believed he'd begun a process, that I would think about his words, that I would adjust. He was wrong. Later that afternoon, I saw him again, this time surrounded by co-workers, laughing loudly. A story was being told, one of those stories that only works if everyone involved agrees to pretend it's harmless. And she actually complained, Daniel said, rolling his eyes. Can you believe that? Laughter followed. Someone said, HR? He scoffed. Please, they told her to be more flexible. More laughter. I didn't react. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I remembered the exact phrasing, the confidence, the names spoken openly, the assumption of immunity. When Daniel noticed me watching, he raised his coffee cup slightly in mock salute. Later, alone at my desk, I added a new section to my document. Daniel Reeves, patterns of behavior, language used, witnesses present. This wasn't personal. It never was. Daniel wasn't the problem. He was a symptom. A loud one, yes, but not the only one. He thrived because no one had ever made him pause mid-sentence and wonder if there might be consequences waiting on the other side of his certainty. Tomorrow, there would be a general meeting. Tomorrow, there would be a podium. And for the first time in a very long while, Daniel Reeves was going to learn what it felt like to speak too much in the wrong room. By the morning of the general meeting, the building felt different. Not quieter, not calmer. Just expectant. Like a room that senses something heavy is about to fall, but can't yet see from where. I arrived early. That, too, went unnoticed. People were already discussing seating arrangements, joking about how these meetings never mattered, how leadership loved to hear itself talk. Someone said there would be pastries. Someone else complained there never were enough. No one wondered why a temporary replacement had been given access to the main hall, because no one imagined I would use it. At my desk, an envelope waited. Plain, unlabeled. Inside were access cards, a slim folder, and a flash drive. The permissions had been granted late the night before, quietly, through channels most people didn't even know existed. I slipped the flash drive into my pocket and didn't touch it again. Not yet. I walked the hall slowly, listening, letting conversations flow around me like water around a stone. Front row, obviously. Daniel already claimed it. He always does. Well, he earned it. Earned it. That word stayed with me. In the main hall, the podium stood empty, polished, slightly elevated. Microphones tested earlier hummed faintly, waiting. Rows of chairs stretched outward like orderly assumptions, front rows confident, back rows disengaged. I was told politely that I would not be speaking. Support staff usually stand near the side, a coordinator explained without looking up from her tablet, just in case. Of course, I said. Of course. I stood near the wall, just as Daniel had suggested the day before. From there, I could see everything. The doors, the exits, the front row filling quickly with people who never questioned why they were there. Daniel arrived precisely on time. He looked comfortable, relaxed, a man at home in his environment. He greeted people with easy familiarity, exchanged jokes, accepted backslaps like confirmations of status. When he saw me, he smiled, slow, knowing. Told you, he said quietly, gesturing toward the wall. Best seat in the house. I returned the smile. The room filled. Conversations softened. Phones were silenced. A low murmur replaced laughter. Someone tested the microphone again. A dull echo spread through the space, demanding attention. I stepped forward. Not to the podium yet. Just enough to be seen. No one reacted. I reached into my bag and took out the folder. Its weight felt deliberate in my hands. Real. I placed it on the small table beside the podium, still saying nothing. Daniel noticed this time. His smile faltered. Just slightly. Not enough to alarm him. Just enough to register curiosity. What's that? He asked, half joking. Preparation, I said. He laughed. You're organized. I'll give you that. The coordinator glanced at me, confused, then back at her tablet. She hesitated, then said nothing. Silence again, doing its quiet work. When the last person sat down, the hall settled into a collective expectation of boredom. That was when I stepped fully into the center. I walked past the coordinator, past the table, up the short steps to the podium. The sound of my shoes against the floor echoed louder than it should have. Someone cleared their throat. Someone whispered, "Who is that?" I placed both hands on the podium and waited until the room stilled, not because I asked, but because uncertainty demanded it. From the front row, Daniel stared at me now. Not smiling, not relaxed, confused. I met his eyes for a moment and then looked out at the room. Inside me, there was no anger, no satisfaction, no rush, only calm. Cold, steady, deliberate calm. Everything was ready. And in a few seconds, every assumption in this room was about to be corrected. I entered the hall last. That, too, was deliberate. By the time I pushed the doors open, every seat was taken. Every conversation already winding down into that dull, obedient murmur people use when they believe nothing important is about to happen. The room smelled faintly of coffee and impatience. Jackets were draped over chair backs. Phones were hidden under tables. Screens dimmed but ready. And the front row was full. Of course it was. Executives, senior managers, department heads, people who had never questioned why they deserved to be closer to power than others. They sat comfortably, legs crossed, arms relaxed, already bored. Among them, exactly where I expected him to be, sat Daniel Reeves. Front row, center left, confident, relaxed. One arm stretched along the back of the empty chair beside him, as if he owned more space than he needed. He laughed quietly at something whispered by the man next to him, nodding like someone who felt safe. When he saw me enter, his expression shifted. Not alarm, not recognition. Mild amusement. He nodded at me. Not respectfully, not formally. Like you nod at someone you've already categorized. I walked down the aisle slowly, not rushing, not hesitating. I could feel eyes following me now, curiosity waking up in the room. People were noticing me for the first time, not because they suddenly saw authority, but because I was doing something unexpected. Daniel's nod lingered in the air between us. There she is, it seemed to say. The quiet one, the nobody, the girl who knows where she belongs. I stopped near the podium. For a brief moment, I didn't move. I let the silence stretch just enough to feel uncomfortable. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed. Someone whispered, "Is she supposed to be here?" Daniel leaned forward slightly, his confidence flickering into something closer to irritation. I could almost hear his thoughts. Why hasn't anyone stopped her? Then I stepped up. One step, then another. The sound echoed more sharply than before. The podium was higher than the floor by only a few inches, but the difference felt immense. Perspective shifted instantly. Faces that had looked past me all day were now tilted upward. I rested my hands lightly on the edge of the podium. No microphone yet. No introduction. Just presence. The room went quiet. Not politely quiet, but the kind of silence that forms when people sense a mistake unfolding and don't yet know how to interrupt it. From the front row, Daniel frowned. He straightened in his seat, the casual sprawl gone. His eyes moved from my face to the podium, then to the coordinator standing frozen near the wall. She didn't move. Neither did anyone else. I looked directly at Daniel. Not with anger. Not with triumph. With recognition. The kind that makes people feel suddenly exposed. His mouth opened slightly, as if to say something. To joke. To object. To reclaim control. But no sound came out. He closed it again, shifting in his chair. For the first time since I had arrived at this company, Daniel Reeves did not know how to behave. I reached for the microphone and turned it on. The soft click echoed through the hall like a verdict. That sound changed everything. Dozens of people straightened instinctively. Phones disappeared, hands folded. Attention snapped into place, not because they respected me, but because authority had just announced itself. Unexpectedly, undeniably. I took a slow breath. From the podium, the room looked different. Smaller, more fragile. All those confident expressions suddenly carried questions, doubt, calculation. Daniel sat very still now. His front row seat no longer looked like privilege. It looked like exposure. And as I opened my mouth to speak, I knew, with absolute certainty, that every word I said next would land harder because of everything they had assumed about me before. The front row was exactly where he wanted to be. He just hadn't understood what it meant to be seen. I let the silence hold for a fraction longer than necessary. Not to be dramatic. Not to intimidate. But because silence, when controlled, forces people to listen more carefully than noise ever could. Then I spoke. My name is Claire Morgan. The microphone carried my voice cleanly across the hall. Calm, even, unrushed. Not loud. Volume would have suggested emotion, and emotion would have suggested weakness. A ripple moved through the room. Not surprise yet. Just attention sharpening. I am here as the temporary executive replacement for Richard Hale during his absence. That was when the air changed. It wasn't audible, but it was unmistakable. The collective shift of posture, the subtle tightening of shoulders, the way people suddenly realized they might have misfiled me under the wrong category. I will be overseeing operations, compliance, and internal conduct for the next 30 days, I continued. With full authority, Delegated by the board. I paused. Not long. Just enough. From the front row, Daniel's face drained of color. Not all at once. It happened in stages. First confusion, then denial, then something dangerously close to understanding. His eyes widened slightly, then narrowed, as if he were trying to rewind the last 24 hours and rewrite them fast enough to matter. It didn't. I looked directly at him when I spoke next. For clarity, I said, that authority includes personnel decisions, investigations, suspensions, and immediate policy enforcement. No one laughed now. No one whispered. No one dared to move. Daniel's mouth opened, closed. His jaw tightened. I could see the calculation racing behind his eyes. How much I knew, how much I'd heard, how exposed he might be. Too late. I want to be very clear, I continued, shifting my gaze across the room. I was instructed not to announce my arrival, not to wear visible markers of status, not to correct assumptions made about me. A murmur stirred, quickly silenced by the weight of implication. This was not a test, I said. It was an observation period. Daniel leaned back slowly, as if distance could protect him. It couldn't. For one full working day, I went on, I was treated as support staff. I was spoken to without a name, without context, without basic professional respect. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I simply stated facts. I was asked to fetch coffee. I was commented on. I was advised, unsolicited, on how to advance my career through flexibility. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone swallowed audibly. Daniel's eyes dropped to his hands. I turned a page in the folder on the podium. And I was told, verbatim, how this company really works. That was when he knew. Not suspected. Knew. He looked up at me then, panic flickering across his features before discipline forced it back into something rigid and hollow. I met his gaze steadily. Daniel Reeves, I said. The sound of his name in my voice was louder than any raised tone could have been. You sat in the front row today because you believed you were untouchable. A collective inhale rippled through the room. You were wrong. I closed the folder gently and placed my hands back on the podium. This month is not about punishment, I said calmly. It is about correction, accountability, and restoring the difference between confidence and entitlement. I let my eyes move across every face, those who looked down, those who stared straight ahead, those who suddenly wished they'd chosen a seat farther back. I will now begin by addressing what was said to me yesterday morning, I continued. Word for word, with timestamps. Daniel didn't look at me again. He didn't need to. The room already understood something fundamental had shifted. They finally knew who had been standing in front of them all along, and there was no pretending anymore. I did not raise my voice. I didn't need to. The microphone carried every syllable evenly, without emphasis, without emotion, like a recording played back in a room that suddenly wished it had never been made. Yesterday, I said, at 8:42 a.m., near the reception desk, I was stopped by a senior sales employee. I looked down briefly at the open folder, then back up. The words spoken to me were, "Oh, are you the new secretary for adult entertainment for our boss?" The sentence hung in the air. It didn't sound like a joke anymore. It sounded exactly like what it was. A low murmur rippled through the hall, quickly suppressed by the heaviness that followed. Someone in the back row shifted. Someone else crossed their arms tightly, as if bracing themselves against recognition. I turned a page. At 10:11 a.m., near the copy room, I was told, "Smart women don't fight it, they use it." Another page. At 2:37 p.m., in the open workspace, the phrase "HR prefers silence to paperwork" was spoken openly, followed by laughter. I didn't look at Daniel when I read these lines. I didn't need to. The room was already doing that for me. I could feel eyes turning toward the front row, first cautiously, then openly. Not accusatory yet, just curious. People were aligning what they had heard with what they had laughed at, what they had ignored, what they had excused. I continued. These statements were made under the assumption that I had no authority, no voice, and no relevance beyond convenience. I paused. That assumption is the mirror. Silence. Thick. Uncomfortable. Honest. I lifted my gaze and finally met Daniel's eyes again. Not to humiliate him, to reflect him. He looked smaller now, not physically, but structurally. Like a man whose internal scaffolding had been removed, leaving nothing but posture and habit behind. You were confident, I said calmly. Relaxed. Certain. I turned another page. You spoke freely because you believed there would be no consequences. I closed the folder. Today, I said, you are hearing your own words without the protection of context or complicity. I let that settle. Around the room, faces changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but unmistakably. Some looked shocked. Some looked angry. A few looked ashamed. And some, those were the most interesting, looked relieved. Relieved that something unspeakable had finally been spoken aloud. I stepped slightly away from the podium, not retreating, but opening space. This is not a performance, I said. It is not revenge. And it is not personal. Daniel's jaw tightened. It is structural. I gestured lightly toward the room. This environment did not create one man like Daniel Reeves. It created the conditions that allowed many to behave like him. Quietly, comfortably, repeatedly. No one interrupted me. Not because they were afraid, because they were listening. I want you to understand something, I continued. Everything I have quoted today was said casually, without hesitation, without fear. I turned back to the podium and rested my hands on it once more. That is the real issue. Daniel looked down now. Not in shame, in calculation. I recognized it immediately, the search for angles, for exits, for ways to minimize damage. It was the same expression I had seen on men who had never truly believed they could lose. I took that from him next. For the remainder of my time here, I said, that confidence will no longer be rewarded. A sharp inhale moved through the front row. Words will be documented. Behavior will be addressed. Silence will no longer be interpreted as consent. I met the eyes of the room again. And power, I finished, will no longer be mistaken for volume, posture, or entitlement. I stepped back from the microphone. For a moment, no one moved. No applause. No objections. Just a room full of people staring into a mirror they had avoided for a very long time. And in the front row, Daniel Reeves finally understood what it felt like to be observed, without protection, without illusion, and without control. I didn't give them time to recover. Silence, when prolonged, turns into denial. I wasn't interested in denial. Effective immediately, I said, returning to the microphone. An internal investigation is being opened. This time, the words didn't just land, they spread. I could almost see them moving through the room, passing from person to person, lodging in places where comfort had lived only minutes before. The investigation will cover inappropriate conduct, abuse of position, misuse of authority, and the suppression of formal complaints, I continued. It will be led by an external compliance firm, not internal, not familiar, not negotiable. That last word tightened several jaws at once. Daniel finally spoke. This is... He stopped himself, swallowed, tried again. This is excessive. His voice sounded different now. Thinner, less sure of itself. The confidence he'd worn so easily the day before had collapsed into something brittle. I looked at him. Is it? I asked calmly. He opened his mouth, then closed it, tried again. I was joking, he said quickly. Everyone knew that. No one was harmed. You're blowing this out of proportion. There it was. The oldest defense in the room. I nodded slowly, as if considering his words. Let's examine that, I said. I turned slightly and gestured to the side of the hall. A screen lit up. Another permission quietly granted, another assumption quietly shattered. A list appeared. Dates, times, names, short excerpts, not accusations, records. These are documented interactions, I explained. Some from yesterday, some from months ago, some from years. Daniel's breath caught. These were not all reported, I went on, because reporting was discouraged, minimized, reframed as humor or misunderstanding. I looked back at him. You benefited from that silence. He shook his head. You don't understand how things work. I understand perfectly, I said, interrupting him for the first time. The interruption landed harder than any raised voice could have. This is how it worked, I corrected. Past tense. A murmur spread through the room. Not agreement, recognition. Daniel Reeves, I said, you are hereby placed on immediate administrative suspension pending the outcome of the investigation. The words echoed. Suspension. Front row privilege evaporated instantly. You are to surrender your access badge today, I continued. You will not contact colleagues regarding this matter. Any attempt to influence testimony will be treated as obstruction. He stood halfway, then sat back down, as if his body hadn't yet caught up with the consequences. This is insane, he muttered. Security will escort you out after the meeting, I added. That did it. The room shifted again, this time decisively. Distance appeared around him, subtle but unmistakable. Chairs angled away, eyes moved elsewhere. The ecosystem adapted faster than it ever had for those he'd overshadowed. I turned back to the room. This does not end with one person, I said. Suspensions will follow where evidence supports them. Policy changes will be implemented immediately, training will be mandatory, and compliance will be enforced, not suggested. No one challenged me, not because they were afraid of me, because they were afraid of what had just become visible. I closed the folder. For those of you who believed silence was safety, I said evenly, this will be an adjustment. I glanced once more at Daniel. For those who believed proximity to power made you untouchable, I added, this will be a reckoning. I stepped back from the podium. The meeting ended without applause, without conversation, without relief. People rose slowly, carefully, as if the room itself had become unstable. Daniel remained seated until security approached him quietly from behind. He didn't look at me as he stood. He didn't need to. He already knew the most important thing had changed. He was no longer the one deciding how things worked. And neither was anyone else who had mistaken comfort for immunity. As the hall emptied, I remained where I was, watching the consequences begin, not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. This was not the end. It was the correction. A month can pass quietly. That was the first thing I learned when I stayed long enough to watch people recalibrate. The company did not collapse. It did not erupt into chaos or outrage. There were no dramatic resignations in protest, no open rebellions, no speeches about injustice. What happened instead was more telling. People adjusted. In the first week, voices lowered. Jokes lost their edge. Doors that had always been closed opened more often, especially the one with frosted glass and human resources written on it. Meetings ran longer, not because there was more to say, but because people chose their words carefully now. Emails became polite, documented, precise. By the second week, the phrase, "That's just how it is here," disappeared entirely. I noticed it was replaced with questions. Is this appropriate? Should this be documented? Can we clarify this policy? Not because everyone had suddenly become ethical, because uncertainty had replaced entitlement. Daniel Reeves was not the only one suspended, he was simply the first. Others followed, some quietly, some angrily, some with genuine shock that past behavior could finally reach them in the present. A few resigned before they were asked to explain themselves. Those were the ones who had always known. I never raised my voice during that month. I didn't need to. Authority, once recognized, sustains itself through consistency. Every decision was documented, every process transparent, every conversation followed up in writing. There were no personal vendettas, no public humiliations, no performances. Just structure. Some people struggled with that more than any punishment. In the third week, a woman from marketing stopped me in the hallway. Sophie, the one who used to laugh too loudly. I wanted to say, "Thank you," she said quietly. I didn't realize how much I was excusing until I couldn't anymore. I nodded. That was enough. By the fourth week, the company felt different. Not kinder, not perfect, but alert. A place where behavior was no longer invisible just because it was familiar. On my final day, I packed my bag the same way I had arrived, quietly, without ceremony. There was no farewell email, no announcement, no applause. I walked through the lobby one last time. This time, people looked up. They knew my name now. "Good morning, Ms. Morgan. Thank you for everything. Safe travels." Respect, I'd learned, doesn't always arrive with warmth. Sometimes it arrives with awareness. As I reached the security gate, I paused briefly and looked back at the building. The framed values were still on the wall. Integrity, innovation, respect. They meant something closer to truth now. The gate opened with the same soft click as before. I stepped outside. By Monday, someone else would sit in Richard Hale's office again. Policies would continue, procedures would hold, the system would move forward. Not flawless, but corrected. And I would be gone. That was always the plan. Because power does not need to linger to be remembered. And they would remember my name. Not because I demanded it, but because for 1 month they confused appearance with weakness and learned the cost of that mistake.